Welcome to the Sencast. My name is Dale Pickles. I'm the Managing Director of B Squared and the host of the Sencast, the podcast for special educational needs and disability. Each week on the podcast, we talk about a different topic within the world of SEND to improve our knowledge, to provide support to professionals working in schools, and to empower parents, and of course, raising awareness. In this episode of the Sencast, we discussed DLD, or developmental language disorder, and the SEND reforms. No child should be left behind. I was joined by Jane Harris, the Chief Executive from Speech and Language UK. The Sencast is powered by us here at B Squared, and Connecting Steps, our assessment software, can now show progress for all pupils in primary school, not just those with SEND. That's it. That's right. We can show progress for all pupils from starting point. The system has the smallest step for those working below and less detail for those working at age-rated expectations. It makes it easy to really understand the data for all pupils, to celebrate what works well and to identify where change is needed. Visit the B Square website or click on the meeting link in the show notes to book a meeting with me to take you through our assessment software. Let's get on with that podcast. In this week's show, we are discussing DLD and the SEND reforms and No Child Left Behind. My guest this week is Jane Harris, Chief Executive from Speech and Language UK. Jane is an experienced charity sector leader with over 15 years' experience working and leading at various organisations including the National Autistic Society, Leonard Cheshire Disability and Rethink Mental Illness. She spent her career raising the profile of issues that impact on people's lives, including through influencing public policy. In her previous roles, Jane has helped to measurably change public perceptions of mental health and autism. Welcome to the show, Jane.
Hello, Dale.
So, the SEND reforms. There's lots of conversations going on around right now, and lots of them are on the legal rights, which I'm going to avoid for now.
Okay.
But there are many other conversations that need discussing. And one of those conversations is about speech, language and communication challenges, including DLD, or developmental language disorder, and how these must be recognised and supported more in schools.
That's absolutely right, Dale. So we're really worried at Speech and Language UK that there are 1.3 million children who have developmental language disorder in this country. That means that their learning will be affected. We know those children are much more likely to fall behind at school, between 6 to 10 times more likely to be behind in core subjects like English and math. But they're also much more likely to have mental health problems. Actually, about 45% of children referred to children and young people's mental health services have a speech and language problem. But this is an intersection that is really rarely recognised by mental health services. I would say, actually, it's also rarely recognised by mental health charities. And I'm guilty of being one of those people. When I worked in mental health, I didn't understand these things connected. But what that means is that children can end up with mental health problems, partly related to their speech and language challenges. When they do get to mental health services, they're then offered talking therapies. And surprise, surprise, it's quite hard for a child with speech and language challenges to engage in talking therapies. So you end up with this really ridiculous sort of loop where people think they're going to get support, and then actually it turns out the support just doesn't work for them. But we also know there's a massive connection with children who are not in employment, education and training, because these children are twice as likely to be unemployed when they become young people. But also almost two-thirds of children in the young offenders sort of sector also have speech and language challenges. So actually, we're really doing ourselves a disservice by not recognising that speech and language challenges are at the heart of so many social problems. But part of the issue is they're invisible. And of course, they're silent, because if you've got a speech and language challenge, you can't be explaining to people what is difficult for you. So we really, really need schools to wake up, and colleges and nurseries, to wake up to just how prevalent these conditions are. Because actually, if we don't do that, the SEND reforms won't work, but also nor will the work that Alan Milburn's doing on children not in education, employment and training.
I could go off in so many different directions with what you just said. And where I thought I was going to go initially was not where I'm going to go right now.
Okay.
And we've discussed DLD on the podcast, and there's lots of research, I think, about prisons and communication level skills and things like that. And I think like the average kind of inmate in prison is kind of that communication level, like 11-year-old. And if they're an adult and their communication skills are 11-year-old, where were those skills? What level were those skills in schools?
Yep.
And it's a direct correlation between, I mean, how can you express how you feel? If, as you said, what's wrong and all that, how can you express any of those things around where you need support? What's upsetting you? When you're 3 or 4, some of those things are quite simple. He hit me, did that. Yep. As you get older, it gets so much more complicated. The language required, the understanding required just to kind of navigate through life is really, really complicated. And there is that huge link between those poor communication skills and that impact on their mental health. And often with many things, what we end up supporting is the effect, not the cause.
Exactly.
We're supporting what we see, not actually going, wow, lots of people are struggling with mental health. Is that the issue, or is there something else they're struggling with?
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that the connection between mental health and speech and language challenges is actually quite sort of multi-layered. And because obviously if you're struggling to talk and understand words, it's harder to make friends. And then it in itself, that social isolation increases your risk of mental health problems. But also, I think we don't really estimate correctly how much language affects our ability to regulate our emotions ourselves. Every day, we're all doing self-talk all the time, going, oh, well, that's a bit annoying that my colleague said that, but maybe actually they meant this. So we're using language to sort of rationalize things all the time. We're also using rational language just to sort of name our own feeling. You know, people talk about that all the time in sort of therapeutic setting. That, you know, you have to name what's going on. Well, if you haven't got the language to do it, you haven't got the language to think to yourself, oh, I'm sad. No, I'm not. I'm angry. Oh, I'm frustrated. Like you need this language to actually be able to structure your own thoughts. And then, of course, like I said, you also need language to then engage in therapy. So there's multiple levels at which, of course, it makes sense that there's this intersection. So government is now consulting on a new mental health strategy. We will definitely be sort of responding to that at Speech and Language UK, just to say, if almost half of the children being referred for mental health support have these issues, we need to make sure the mental health support teams in schools are getting training on how to support children with speech and language challenges. But also, of course, we need to do all the stuff around early identification and the right kind of support, which isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but unfortunately, sometimes that's what people think it is.
So I've got lots of questions, lots of thoughts going around in my head. One of the things, and I'm going to go back about 12 years ago, maybe 13 years ago, to when the new kind of primary national curriculum came out. And one of the things they did with that new primary national curriculum is just really reduce the importance of spoken language. So rather than having reading and writing, you have your end of year outcomes, you just have an overall guide for the key stage.
Yep.
With the pre-key stage standards, there are no spoken language pre-key stage standards. I don't know why it's called spoken language anyway, but that's a different thing. That's a whole other conversation. Not the only language for conversations. And I just think that it really sent a message to schools that actually these skills don't matter. Yet in reality, if you can't say it, hear it, understand it vocally or orally, how are you actually going to write those skills down? And it's like this area hasn't been just that importance around this whole area has just dropped over the last 12 years. And I'm wondering, has that had an impact? Or is it, again, one of many things having an impact? I
think it's probably one of a few things having an impact, but it is really important because ultimately, if schools are sort of told to assess things, they notice them, right? This is true for all of us. So we're really pleased that the government is saying they're going to bring in this oracy framework for primary and for secondary schools. And it's really important that it's in secondary schools as well. That feels like a really big step forward. But it does still seem really odd that we're saying we're going to be doing this year 8 reading test without thinking, well, actually, do we also need to be looking at those children's speech and language skills? Because obviously it's harder to learn to read if you can't do speech and language, if you're struggling with speech and language skills. So we've actually just been doing a bit of work down. We run 2 special schools. So we're a sort of national organisation. We work in schools and colleges and nurseries across the country. But we also run our own 2 schools specifically for children with the most complex speech and language challenges. And we've done a lot of work in our primary school in Meath on phonological awareness. So that basically means, how do you hear the difference between b, k and d? Because until you can hear that difference, there is no point getting children to draw in the air what those sounds look like, because you just won't realise that they're different things. And when Ofsted came to visit us a couple of years ago, they really commended that. But that's the kind of approach that we need to make sure is in place. If a child is struggling with speech and language, just doing traditional phonics is not going to work. They may be able to engage in a traditional phonics scheme if they've got pre-skills like, being able to pay attention, but also being able to hear the difference between those sounds. And one of the things we can do as a national charity, which is great, is that we can take the expertise from those schools and then we can share it. So we've sort of used that programme there. We've now created a digital programme, which schools are starting to roll out across the country. But that does also obviously rely on people identifying there's a speech and language challenge in the first place. Government has said that they are going to invest in an identification tool for speech and language, which is good. We haven't seen it yet, so we'll reserve judgment until we see the details. But in principle, that's progress. But we also need to make sure there is absolutely specialist therapy for children who need that one-to-one therapy. You have something like developmental language disorder, and at the moment we don't really see where the workforce is for that.
No, and I guess teachers are very, very busy, and there's a lot of disruption. There's a lot of stuff going on, but for lots of children, and again, you can go into neurodiversity, there are those who disrupt and those who are almost invisible. And I guess it's the same with DLD and those speech and language difficulties. And you mentioned this at the beginning, is then what they're saying, hi, I'm struggling with this. They're not here, they're saying any of this. They're just kind of sitting quietly. And it's that extra work, which almost you could ignore because it's not coming to you, but it's having that time to ask those questions and be able to have time to notice those challenges and those differences, those quiet children, not just going, oh, great, they're quiet, I can focus on the others, but asking, why are they quiet? Why are they not joining in?
I think, to be honest, you can have both groups of children. So it's worth saying that developmental language disorder is a form of neurodivergence. It's not the only form of speech and language challenge. So obviously children can have speech and language issues alongside another condition like autism, like cerebral palsy. They can also have speech and language challenges purely due to poverty and due to disadvantage. Those will not be lifelong if you help them with them. But I think within the DLD group, which is 1.3 million children and young people, you can get quiet children who just who sit at the back of the class who don't really know what's going on. A lot of children learn masking strategies effectively. It's just a slightly different type of masking from autism. So they will watch what the other children are doing and copy them because they haven't understood what the teacher's saying, right? And what will often happen is the teacher will think that child's doing okay, and then suddenly they're in an environment where they can't copy the other children, and the teacher will be totally bemused as to why this child is suddenly struggling. But the other thing that can happen, and this is probably more likely in secondary schools, is that children can get into trouble for not doing well. People don't realise it's because of DLD, and then they actually can become really frustrated and can end up being excluded. We did a poll with YouGov a couple of years ago, and over 3/4 of teachers said that children with speech and language challenges were being unfairly punished in schools, which is absolutely incredible when the teaching profession themselves are saying that is happening. It shows that we've really got a crisis on our hands, because you end up with this awful cycle that children get into where they don't understand what's going on. Then they get blamed for not understanding what's going on. Sometimes it's really ridiculous rules, like you haven't brought the right pen to the class. Whereas actually we should just be celebrating that the child has brought a pen to the class, even if it's the wrong colour, right? But then they get into trouble for that. And then they end up feeling really disengaged and feeling really frustrated because it's not their fault. And also they haven't got the language to explain. So they can't say to the teacher, well, I didn't understand that it wasn't that pencil, because they're just not, they're just not equipped to do that. So those children can then become some of the disruptive ones, but they're doing that because their issues haven't been identified.
And that bit there about, and again, secondary schools, is my daughters have gone through secondary school. It wasn't the most joyous time in their lives. But one of those challenges is the school used a certain, I think they used maths mainly, but also science. It's a well-known one, I won't name it. But you had to achieve 100% to actually complete your homework.
Yeah.
So you had to get a question right before you move on. Absolutely hated it. So my daughter used AI to get the homework done. And she did try and learn from the AI, so she didn't have to always use it. But the school had set it so they had to get every question right to achieve their homework. And I just find it really bonkers that the school did the work and do all this. I think in another subject, when my daughter said, I don't understand it, the option was, like, not will you go over it in class? The option was, if you don't understand it, you need to give up your break time to go somewhere to learn it.
Wow.
And it's like, that's a voluntary detention for the child not understanding being taught. It's a detention. That child is having to miss a break because they don't understand. That makes no sense to me at all.
That's really interesting. So I have heard of, I know somebody who homeschools children who are neurodivergent, and she's had lots of problems with some of those sort of AI enabled systems. So she was mentioning sort of in maths, that, you know, if a child made a spelling mistake, even though they got the maths right, it would be just wrong. And I guess because she's one person with adult with two children, she can then go back and try and, you know, so she knows which platforms not to use anymore. I think that's a real issue. I did also hear of a child in year 3 who was given a detention for not capitalising her sentences right. And I'm just like, that is not a behavioural issue. That's an academic issue. And I just think I really do think we've got behavioural guidance wrong in this country, and we absolutely need to review it. 2 of the things we're calling for is that whenever a teacher gives some kind of sanction, they should have to put some kind of sort of theory or explanation for why they think that behaviour happened, because you need to get people thinking it's about going back to the root cause. So there needs to be sort of prompts within the system to make sure they think that. But the other thing is, I think all behaviour policies should explain what the links between difficult behaviour and each type of SEND could be. You could just have a paragraph explain, if a child has a speech and language challenge, they might not understand the instructions. They might be more isolated. They might not be able to give you the context of what went wrong. Just, you know, but you could do the same for that. You could do that for autism. You could do that for mental health. You could do that for everything. Just to be clear that behaviour happens in a context. Neither of those things would cost any money, and I really do hope the Department for Education will consider those seriously.
I'm still just lost as you said the words together. A child in year 3 at detention.
Yep.
Wow, that is, that's going to stay with me for a while. That a child in primary has got a detention, that should not happen.
Yep. Agreed.
No. I won't start on secondary detentions and things, but I love your idea about the kind of that teacher having that reason to kind of, you give them detention for X. Now explain what you think the underlying cause is.
Yes.
I would go one further. Give that child the opportunity as well.
Yes, that sounds a great idea. Yeah.
Because so many times and again, I've just through various work I do through my social work or youth work type stuff I do, the child or young person is hardly ever given a voice in those situations. So even if the teacher logged all these things down, they got all these detentions, at the moment they just go on detentions. If the teacher just says, well, I just think they're being this, again, is actually having a voice from that child, being able to say, that child, I didn't understand the homework.
Yes.
That's why I didn't do it.
Yeah.
Just that sentence, seeing that 12 times would start ringing alarm bells for me.
Exactly. You can pick up some patterns.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And again, I think school has changed over the last however many years since I was at school. Lots has changed. And technology has benefited in certain ways.
Yep.
And lots of the documents, lots of the speeches and all the kind of things going on over the last year or so is asking for more communication. And I think schools can hear that as the schools need to share more. I personally think of communication as two-way.
Absolutely.
So that needs to be, you need to give your parents more opportunity to have a voice. You need to give your students more opportunity to have a voice. And you need to listen.
Yes.
Because at the moment, I don't think either side are listening to each other.
I think that's really
parents
true.
And schools. And I think schools have to be the one to offer the olive branch, to put that opportunity out, to give that voice, and to show they're listening, to build those partnerships again.
I absolutely agree that. I mean, and I would say I don't think there's any school in the country that is getting this 100% right. We're actually doing some work internally in our schools at the moment about how we listen to parents. We have had some feedback that says that it's getting better, so that's really good. But I actually, somebody said to me, I thought this was so insightful, that actually if you've got a child with speech and language challenges, they don't tell you what's happened during the school day. And that was such an important insight for us, that actually we need to communicate like probably 10 times more than any other school, because that child probably isn't coming home as often and telling the parent what happened. And so we have to be sort of overcompensating for that. But yeah, I did just want to say on the technology point, I think there's also a massive missed opportunity here. So obviously some children with really complex speech and language challenges will never use speech to communicate. That's just not speech like conventional speech. But they can use signing, they can use symbols, and they can also use some technology to communicate. And that can be absolutely life-changing for those children and for those families. Even just simple things like being able to say what it is you want for lunch. I mean, that's really important for all of us to be able to say what kind of food we do and don't want. At the moment, we've got this commissioning guidance on what's called alternative and augmented communication aids, AAC. That covers a huge range of devices, from the sort of stuff that Stephen Hawking used, like voice output sort of aids, but all the way through to kind of eye gaze technology, where you can use your eyes to kind of to indicate sort of what words you want to say. So there's massive opportunities in that technology, but there's nothing at the moment in the SEND reform about that commissioning guidance. And unfortunately, the guidance at the moment is absolutely opposite of all of the government's principles to SEND reform. The government talks about things being early. Well, actually, to get AAC at the moment, because you have to get it commissioned through, education and health working together, you have to be able to show that the child can proactively use the device before you give it to them. You can't show that they will be able to. I mean, if you do some learning, but they have to be able to proactively use it to some extent. They have to be able to proactively communicate. So that's actually that's literally waiting to a later stage before actually giving them the technology that might help them. So it always makes me laugh when people talk about, AI, and I'm sure there are roles for AI. I did a really helpful 6-week course on AI last year. There are things that all organisations can use AI for. There are also things we absolutely can't use it for and shouldn't use it for. We've got to be clear about that. But there's other technologies that it feels like we're ignoring in SEND and education that actually we could be doing so much more with. I really remember when I first went to an interview at National Autistic Society, I was interviewed by a group of young people, and one of them was called Isabel. She was the most eloquent young person I've ever met. She never used her voice to communicate. It was all entirely through an iPad, and I've never forgotten that. But actually, if we're thinking about children being out of work, let's make sure that those children are equipped with the devices they need quickly, rather than waiting till they've had all those difficult experiences of not being able to communicate.
And interesting on that kind of bit where we're using alternative communication is, as kind of there are more children and there's also more ways to communicate when 2020 COVID, more people working at home, there is less face-to-face communication at work. Actually, we're using Teams, Slack, something else, but we're using like instant messaging. And to me, that's not really writing.
No.
It's we use the term spontaneous communication and recorded communication. And with Stephen Hawkins, his communication method was the same for both, whether he was writing a book or whether he was having a conversation with you. But the skills he would use were completely different. One was very much responding to the other person, making sure that, whereas that writing process is thought out, really taken into account, gone over again and again, structured, all those sorts of things. And again, as soon as you say the word spoken language, everyone immediately thinks it has to be vocal. It has to be oral.
Yep.
And even people use verbal. And I go, well, verb's a word. I don't like the term non-verbal. Or it's like, well, that means they can't use words. But if they can read, they're verbal.
Yeah.
So I think we kind of need to help people understand. We need to move away from that idea of spoken language.
So we were really...
And even... Go on.
I was just going to say, we were really pleased, actually. So we run this thing called the Speech, Language and Communication Alliance. We and a colleague, Stephen Parsons, who used to be at NAPLIC, co-chair it. And we were really pleased, actually. We won an award earlier this week. Last week, actually, end of last week, which was basically about the definition of oracy that has gone into the curriculum review. And we were really pleased it does include signing, symbols and AAC. So that we really, really pushed both the Oracy Commission, that predates the curriculum review, and the people working on the curriculum review, that they had to include those other forms of communication. I really hope that is going to give schools a bit of a prompt that you can't think about oracy without thinking about these other forms of communication.
Definitely. In our software, we've got rid of says or taught. We use the term communicates as much as possible. And at the lower level, we do use word signs or symbols. So it's a real, although this is spoken language, in reality, I'm not assessing can they say the word. I'm assessing, do they understand the word? Can they use it correctly? Yeah.
Great.
That to me is, and so again, maybe changing away from spoken language to communication. So we would make life more aware.
I think what's difficult is we did some work. So we changed our name from ICANN to Speech and Language UK. Goodness, 5 years ago. 4 years ago. Still time is flying. But then that was partly because we talked to families. We also talked to educators about sort of what word use to explain the needs of this group of children. And what we found was that actually, if you just say communication, unfortunately, people think about communication. So they think about adverts, they think about social media, they think about things like presentation skills, right? So actually, what's you and I, it makes total sense to people in the field. But part of the issue here is we haven't got enough public awareness around this group of conditions. And one of the things I really learned working in autism and in mental health is you have to start where the public are. Like we can't, if we keep using our terminology, we will never bring people into this. So we usually talk about children having difficulties with speech and language or difficulties with talking and understanding words. Because if people understand what that means, and we have got to talk about the public is not aware how many children are struggling with this. It's over 2 million children when you include the children who are struggling with due to poverty and disadvantage, as well as due to DLD or to other forms of SEND. So that's it's 1 in 5 children. And the public debate does not suggest that people understand how many children are affected. So I think we have got to think about how we talk about this in a way that engages the widest possible audience, which isn't usually using the terminology that the sector likes the best, unfortunately. Otherwise, life would be so much simpler.
Yeah, I would do lots of other changes, but that's just me. I would move comprehension out of reading and move it somewhere else completely. But just going back to kind of, and you mentioned that with the reforms and the new curriculum, which we've still got to wait till next year to find out what's in it. This oracy part, I think, is such a big part of the curriculum. It's for all children. My daughter's going through school. No child seems to like being asked a question in class. So many schools, it's just the anxiety of having to be asked by the teacher, or even being told by the teachers, if you put your hand up first and ask a question you're confident with, I won't pick on you later because you've kind of got it out of the way. All these sorts of things, which is a great way. My daughter went, actually, if I choose the answer I give, then I can get what I know out of the way. I won't get asked what I don't know. But lots of children struggle with these speaking in front of other children. And both my daughters, all their classes, they just don't like it. But I don't know if that is a like, or if it is a difficulty, or if it is a confidence thing. So actually, for having those opportunities to discuss and converse, and be confident speaking in class from an early age and carry it through, that is going to be a huge difference, not just for those who do have difficulties, but for all children.
Yes. So one of the things we do is we run this program called Talk Boost, and we run it for sort of pretty much through every key stage, but starting from the early years. And what that does is it takes the children who've been identified by teachers as having issues with talking and understanding words, and we work with them in small groups, so of about 8 children. And it's a structured program. It goes over, depending on the program, it goes anywhere between 8 and 13 weeks. But the routines in that are very, very structured. So children get used to talking in a small group. It's not talking always in the whole class, but it sort of starts to build those kind of skills. But what's quite interesting is when we talk to teachers, so we've got really clear evidence that those kind of programs help children to catch up. So about 50% of children after one of those programs delivered by a teaching assistant will have caught up with their peers, which is fantastic. Another 30% of children will have made significant progress. So they probably need something, to do the program again or a similar sort of intervention. And then about 20% of children will have lifelong speech and language challenges and need to see a speech and language therapist to kind of work that out. But actually what's really interesting is teachers often tell us, as well as those impacts on language, which we can evidence, they see things like behaviour improved because they actually see that children can now communicate their needs better, right? But also they're just able to participate, because if you are sitting there and you do not understand what's going on, it's just not, of course you're going to end up with bad behaviour. If you took a child, I know, say you took a sort of, an early years child, you put them in a university lecture, they're not going to engage because they're not going to know what's going on. And it's a similar thing. We've got to prepare children for the environments that we're expecting them to function in.
And I think a big thing is both of my daughters struggle with saying to the teacher, I don't understand, raising their hand up, I'm not sure. And if all the children are too scared to do that, then the teacher is in that situation where you're teaching up here and the children's understanding is down here. It's not going to be recorded. It's not going in. So we need to make all children, I'm going to say, confident communicators. They all need that. And it's that one of those crucial areas that is underpinning every other aspect of their life.
Yes, absolutely. And we see that, so in our schools, we absolutely see that this is just central to every single lesson. So for example, if you were in a science lesson, say key stage 3 science lesson up at our school that covers secondary, they'd be doing signing. So every time they'd say proton, they would sign it. They would also sort of sound it out phonetically. So that would I think there's something about teaching these skills absolutely explicitly rather than assuming that children are picking them up implicitly. And I was told that when the education system was first founded, I've never found a reference to this. If anybody knows the reference, please contact me. I'd love to know. But apparently there was a discussion about should schools be teaching children to talk? And actually there was literally a documented decision that that isn't part of the education system, because actually that's something that parents should be doing. Well, I don't know whether that was right in all those decades back, but it's absolutely not right now. As in an age where we rely on communication so much more, but also we just see the impact on children's lives. So at Dawn House, which is our all through school, we actually have a special unit there called Chimes, where children can go who've been out of education for a long time. So the average is that a child has been out of education for 2 years. But that entire school last year, 100% of leavers went into employment, education and training. So it's really obvious that if you put in the right specialist support, you can then massively change those children's outcomes.
And that's the thing is, if a child leaves school with, let's say, no GCSEs and poor communication skills, that is going to have a much huge impact on their future life.
Yep.
If they leave with no GCSEs but much better communication skills, they'll be able to advocate for themselves. They'll be able to actually communicate what they want to do. If they're frustrated, they can. But just being able to have those skills means those GCSEs can come later. But in reality, to get those GCSEs, you need those communication skills.
Yes. But also, I suppose the other thing we try to do there is think about what are the realistic vocational options for those children. So they do quite a lot of work on, for example, animal care. They do a sort of hair and beauty module. If you go there on Friday, you might get your hair cut. So that's quite nice. Might not really get your hair done, maybe not a full cut, depends who's doing it. There's a motor vehicle maintenance course. Once a week, the kids go to, one of the year groups goes to a nearby town, and they run a cafe up to the morning. So they're just getting all of those skills in practice. So that I think that, I am concerned that sometimes we're not looking at the good practice within the SEND sector that could help with the issue around children not in education, employment and training. We need to join these things up much more.
Definitely. And I think, again, just thinking of GCSEs, and I compared 2 different children to 2 different communication skills, that isn't really evidenced anywhere.
Yeah. Yes.
There isn't a way of showing this child has great communication skills and this child doesn't, because they both haven't achieved their GCSE. And there needs to be a way of, and again, I think that maybe what they're trying to do at year 8, I have no idea why they're doing the year 8 stuff. It's not SATs apparently, but it looks very much like SATs. But it is, how can schools understand, support and promote those communication skills?
Yes, exactly. And I think that's about making all teachers across the curriculum realising that every single lesson is relying on that, and actually realising that in every single lesson we are learning through words. Do you mean it's not just in English that we're doing that? It's actually everything. So one of the other things we do every year is we run a day called No Pens Day. Actually just happened just this May. And particularly, I think thousands of primary schools take part every year. And so we ask schools on that day to put down pens for the day and just teach through talking. And children love it. But I have to say, at one point we were doing some research to think about exactly how we should run that day for the future. And it was absolutely staggering and upsetting that one of the teachers we talked to said, I would absolutely love to do this, but this isn't what Ofsted want me to do. And you just feel like, oh my God. I'm not sure that Ofsted would agree, right? And there's a question about, are people interpreting Ofsted in a way that it isn't actually meant, right? But also, if that's the case, we need to make sure that Ofsted are clear that those kind of skills are the foundations of everything that Ofsted is asking around literacy and numeracy. It's much, much harder to perform in things like English and reading and writing, but actually maths is also harder if you've got poor speech and language and communication skills. So actually the evidence is that children struggle even more with maths than with English if they've got poor speech, language and communication skills. And that's because so much of the language is abstract. So for example, I'm just reaching for an object. You can really easily, if a child's struggling with speech, language communication, you can point at a spoon and that's really clear that that's a spoon. It's very hard to point at shape or number or even just a square. Because are you pointing at a square or are you just pointing at, whatever shape that particular table is or whatever it is? It's really difficult. So there is just something about trying everybody recognising that this is absolutely the core of our curriculum. It's this weird thing that actually the thing that facilitates every single other subject, we pay the least attention to.
That thing, I love the idea of No Pens Day. Ofsted are not against that.
Yeah.
I wonder how many people either misinterpret Ofsted themselves or are asking for things and using Ofsted as the excuse. I know lots of schools. I hear stories where students will write down, we did drama today in their book, almost like as an evidence of what they did.
Sure.
It's like,
what's the point of that? Yeah.
And it's almost like it's a fear of Ofsted.
Yes.
And that runs.
That's really true.
Ofsted, it's a fear of Ofsted.
Yeah.
Not necessarily based on fact.
Yes.
And again, someone will also hear that No Pens Day and will probably say, well, actually, all the research shown that actually by writing things down, that's when the learning happens. It's kind of that short-term memory. Problem is, I've never, ever seen research of someone who's never written, but only typed.
Yes. Yeah.
Does that help memory? It's always from the other way around.
Yes. I think that's actually...
It's not...
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that's a really good example of. I really think there's an issue that the research base at the moment so often excludes children with special educational needs. So we hear all these things, and you're like, but actually, it's a bit like women's health when we have all these studies on health, but actually it hasn't included women in a sample, and then it turns out, do you know what? Women's bodies are slightly different. Well, actually, the way that children with SEND learn is often going to be very difficult. Not even sometimes. Actually, probably your default assumption should be it's going to be a bit different. It might not be 100% different, but it's going to be slightly different. But yet the problem is that our teachers are trained based on an evidence base that does not include those learners. And then they apply that evidence as though it's like 100% fact. And it's really, really difficult to get people to move from that. And again, I think that's one thing that government's got to tackle. When at the moment, they're sort of procuring extra SEND training, and that is a really good thing to do. We've got to think about what initial teacher training says, and teachers at least need to understand that the evidence base is not there for some of these children, and so they need to be open to some different approaches.
That's interesting that the medical research around women is, I only knew that. I only learned about that 5 years ago. And it's one of those things that certain things just haven't been tested on women. And you're like, what? Why not? Why wouldn't, what? No. But it's like realization going, hang on. So actually how ibuprofen works on women, no one actually knows. They've just assumed, it works for men, it probably works for women. And just so many things like that where you don't realize you would have assumed actually this evidence base would be covering everybody. No. And again, the research, when someone's following this thing, is, actually it covers everyone. No.
Yep.
And also, technology has moved a lot in the last 20 years. There's so many things you can do, so many extra things that you can use technology to do. And we're still using kind of old research based on how people learn. And I think that really needs kind of going back and looking at, and lots of things like that. We need to just go back and have a fresh look at and ask fresh questions.
Yeah.
There is a document out at the moment about interventions around SEND. And it's kind of saying these don't work. And then everyone does this because there's thin evidence it does. I went, but there's no evidence saying it doesn't. And sometimes with evidence, it can be misrepresented to give a certain point of view.
Yep.
It's how someone's using it. But often, actually, if you look at what the evidence says, it's not saying what that person says it says. It's a difference.
And I think to be honest, I think DFE are sounding more pragmatic about this and recognising they're going to have to go with like the balance of professional opinion on some things, because we're just not at that stage. I do worry that sometimes policy making still it's either sort of trying to follow the evidence in this really strict way, or it just goes with kind of what it thinks the most popular view is. And I think that's another reason why these children with speech and language challenges just get forgotten. Because for example, developmental language disorder is a heritable condition. So those parents of those children are not the ones who are writing to their MPs. So they do not get the hearing. They are not on social media advocating for themselves. So things, for example, so when DFE published the SEND consultation in February, they included these specialist provision packages. There isn't really one that covers language. So it is sort of there it's in the social and emotional development ones, but language is a thing in its own right? It's not, and actually, and if you've got 1.3 million children, a lot of those children will be able to cope in mainstream if you've got the right adapted teaching, and they can get speech and language therapy. That's not a given. So that's a whole, we need to make sure that the mainstream system is geared up to do that. But there are some children who will need either special schools or will need specialist spaces. And that those children, those specialist provision packages are meant to cover the specialist spaces as well as special schools. But we know that in recent years, actually, the number of those specialist spaces for those children has been going down. So they've gone up for autism, which is a good thing. I've got an autistic child myself, so I know that's really important. But it's not right to trade these children off against each other. And unfortunately, because the speech and language community sort of by definition is going to be quieter because these children have those challenges, they just get overlooked. So we really need to make sure that actually DFE isn't just looking at an evidence base that doesn't include these children, or just going with kind of, well, that's the popular thing that's being talked about in the Commons, because otherwise that's not prevalent and that's not impact. We need to actually look at, what numbers are there of these children and what's the best professional opinion. I would just like to say we're really pleased that there are 2 speech and language therapists now on the group that are developing those packages. So hopefully that can be resolved. But we do think there needs to be a specific package for children who are struggling with speech and language. Not to say that children in some of the other categories won't have some of those issues, but you need a slightly different package for the children who have speech and language alongside another condition from children who have speech and language issues as their primary need.
And I'm just going to circle back right back to the beginning. You talked around that link between communication and mental health and that, and masking. And often children will mask, well, not often, children can mask poor communication skills with behaviour.
Yes, absolutely.
They can
100%.
use to work. They can distract. They can walk out of classroom. They can do all of these things they get sanctioned for, but the underlying cause is communication skills.
Yeah.
And I wonder, when we have these provisions where they talk, we're an SEMH provision, actually, again, and again, I'm not downplaying, I'm not at all, but it's how much digging down before that point was done to identify the cause.
Absolutely agree with you. I actually think there's a problem. So I think it's understandable when you first identify a child's needs, you don't know that much, right? It's very difficult at that point to distinguish between social and emotional stuff, right? That's fine. I think at the point that you've got to a specialist revision package, you should be sure whether the issue is a social disability like autism or it's a mental health issue like attachment issues or trauma, because actually we've got a real, this isn't really a speech and language specific point, but we've got a real issue, I think, in SEMH schools. People say this all the time, that you see that there's children who've been diagnosed late with autism in those schools, and they are by that point settled in those schools. And so nobody wants to move them because we don't want another transition for an autistic child, right? But they're actually around children who've got sort of traumatic histories, and those children need really great support as well, but they have really unpredictable behaviour because of those traumatic histories, and that is the opposite of what the autistic children need. You're literally setting up the system. It's not actually that the interventions that you might be doing for those two groups might not always be that different, but the problem is literally their needs are opposing, and one group of children makes the other children's learning harder. So I think there's a whole question there. I mean, I do think, so I should say I'm also vice chair of the Disabled Children's Partnership. So we sort of cover all of these, issues, autism, mental health, everything else, learning disability. But yeah, I think there's a real issue with how that SEND consultation has thought about mental health, because actually I think it feels like there's a push to say, well, mental health is the NHS's responsibility. Well, yes, it is partly the NHS's responsibility, but if a child has real attachment issues, they are going to need a different form of education. And you can't just say that's for the NHS to sort out, because actually they might need a totally adapted curriculum. They might need much smaller class sizes. They still need something structured that is very, very different. But I think, this does go back to what we were saying at the beginning, doesn't it? We need to understand the root causes of what's going on. I'll just give one more example in that I think is really interesting. There's a university in London that set up a DLD clinic, which is brilliant. There's not many developmental language disorder clinics in the country. It's massively underdiagnosed. And it's quite funny when people talk about overdiagnosis. So you always want to go, not over here, actually. Massively underdiagnosed developmental language disorder, tiny numbers. But really interestingly, so this is a clinic for adults, not for children, but more adults who are now referred to the autism clinic in the same building and now diagnosed with DLD than autism. Because what they know about is that actually if they're having a problem with communication, it must be autism. Well, no, it might not be actually, but it's just that that's where the public awareness is. And I want there to be great public awareness for autism because my son benefits from that and our whole society benefits from that. But we need to make sure that the awareness is there around developmental language disorder as well, because it's even more children. And actually, if we don't really change that awareness, both in society and in our schools and within sort of policy-making environments, we are going to fail this generation of children, just like we failed previous generations.
Definitely. And one bit, I think, I personally like mental health being removed out of SEMH. Again, you can go either way on this one. Depends how the government move forward with this. But to me, I found in certain situations that unless you're on the Senko's radar, you can't get that mental health support.
Right.
And that's one thing I think the government is trying to change is anyone can struggle with mental health. Yeah. There is those with a diagnosis, there are those without, and there are those not yet diagnosed but struggling.
Yes.
And so to me, I'm hoping they've pulled it out so that barrier of if the Senko doesn't know you can't get mental health support. I'm hoping, but I think the concern is we're pulling out of that and that's the NHS jobs to pick it up.
Yeah.
That's a bit, I'm really hoping, I'm seeing positive, and hopefully when we get more detail, I'll be happy, but I may not be.
Yeah, there's a few things that aren't there. Yeah, I suppose one of the other ones for us on that is that there's nothing at the moment also about specialist teachers for children with speech and language challenges. So we run to schools specifically for that group of children. There's no clear national qualification for how you become one of those teachers. So they do exist, for example, for teachers of deaf, for teachers of children with multisensory impairments. That's great. We haven't got enough of either of those teachers, but at least the qualifications are there. Actually, I always think when people say, why is this failing? It's because we just don't have the specialist knowledge in enough places. It exists in the country. It's so frustrating because as a country, we have such great practice in loads of these things. Speech and language therapy was invented in the UK and the US. We've got loads of the whole world. We've got academic institutions that are doing some great jobs on this. We've got special schools, like both of our schools are Ofsted outstanding in all areas. They're doing great work. They get great outcomes for children. But a lot of this knowledge is hidden away. But we do need to make sure that we've got enough of these specialists. And at the moment, we don't have those qualifications in place. We also haven't got any kind of clear workforce plan from the NHS, say, about speech and language therapists or occupational therapists. And ultimately, it's people who make a difference in children's lives, right? It's great to have some more money to build specialist resource bases, but if we don't have the therapists and the teachers and the specialist teachers to work in them, we're not going to change more children's lives. And I do believe the government wants to do the best thing for children, but there are just some real holes in the plan at the moment that we need to fill.
Definitely. That's the thing. I think I squint at the white paper at the moment and the SEND reforms because we haven't got enough detail, and I'm generally liking what I'm seeing, but we need detail. We need to know what they actually mean by this, what that's going to look like, because there are lots of things where there are positives and there are big holes, and it's like, okay, is the hole there because it's not changing, or is the hole there because you forgot?
Yeah.
Or is that coming? There's lots of things like EOTAS and things like that not mentioned.
Yep.
We need to know more.
Yes. But the prize is huge, right? The prize is huge in terms of children's lives, but the prize is also huge in terms of our society and our economy. So between the Disabled Children's Partnership and the Speech Language Communication Alliance, we published some work done on sort of the economic benefits of investing properly in children. And we found that if you provided the right support to just half of children with speech and language challenges, that's about 15% of the SEND population overall, you could get £8 billion of economic benefit. Anything that begins with a billion is always a good thing for government when it's positive, right? So we've really got to I think we've got to make sure that we're really clear that these are children who we need to invest in, because actually they could form, part of the answer to transforming our economy as well as our society, as well as just being the right thing to do by those children.
But I think the thing is, and as you said, the numbers aren't there. They're not advocating, they're not making that much of a noise. And there's also no real measurements, because there's all that thing of you measure, you value what you measure.
Yep.
Yeah, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And I think certain things like this are in that it doesn't exist because there isn't a table showing it's going down.
Yeah.
And actually, what did that look like? But again, coming back to that white paper, in the white paper and SEND reforms, there was that graph that SEMH is the biggest growing area. Yep. But actually, again, how much of that is the cause or how much of that is the effect?
Yes.
And so many schools will just say, we can't manage his behaviour. And it's like, but what's the cause?
Exactly.
Behaviour doesn't come from nowhere. There's a reason. And I wonder if, again, as we move through these reforms, as things change, if we have different measuring sticks for different things in different areas, actually, will that percentage of all those children come out of SEMH into different areas and actually show a more realistic picture of what's happening?
I think that's really likely. So a lot of people, you can really see there's a group of children who are classed as having speech, language and communication as their primary need in primary school. And those same children, when they move to secondary, suddenly it's become SEMH. What is actually going on there? And I guess in a class with a consistent teacher, maybe more adults around, the speech, language and communication need might be more obvious. When you've got different teachers, different subjects, suddenly it's actually the behaviour and it gets recorded as SEMH. I totally agree with you.
So I'm going to wrap it up there. I think we could probably bounce along forever on this one, different things and staying loosely on topic. But I think we digress more as we went on. So let's wrap it up. Thank you for coming on the show today. Really enjoyed the conversation. There's lots to reflect on with the changes, and it's nice to raise those profiles of those smaller groups, those smaller conversations that, although smaller, actually are huge for those children within that group.
Yeah.
So small group, big impact, and lots of these conversations over the next couple of years need to happen to make sure that everyone is aware and everyone is thinking about all these groups, not just that main big group, which are doing generally fine, but actually everyone who needs that support. Jane's given me lots of detail, lots of information. So lots of links to speech and language, so you can follow the work they do. Stuff around the SEND reforms, their version of the white paper. Also links to the white paper and others. So there's loads of information all about DLD and speech language communication needs. And you'll find all of those in the show notes, and you'll find the show notes, as always, wherever you listen to the podcast or on the Zencast website. If you want to get in touch, let us know your thoughts, suggest topics or anything else, please message us via one of our social media channels. We're on most of them. Or send an email to hello@thezencast.com. The Zencast is created by us here at B Squared, and Connecting Steps, our assessment software, can now show progress for all pupils in primary schools, not just those with SEND. The system has smaller steps of progress for those working below, less detail for those working at age-related expectation, but it means you can show progress from starting point for all pupils. And it makes it easy to understand your data for all pupils, to celebrate what works well and where change is needed, not just for those working at ARE, but for all of your pupils. Visit the B Squared website or click on the meeting link in the show notes to book a meeting with me to take you through our assessment software and how it can help your school. But for now, thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode of the Zencast. It's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Thanks so much, Dale.
Bye, everyone.